Good morning. This is Hammer Smith Chess Club, junior hour in 5 minutes or so. This video is a summary of an endgame session we had in April 2020. It's about pawn endings. And we go through the various terms you will read in books, you will see in videos, and you will again and again come across in your own games. So it's worthwhile to know the basic terms and rules. Whenever you feel you need more time to understand the specific position that I will show, just stop the video, look at the position, try to find the next move yourself, and then continue. Now, the first and by far the most important term in pawn endings that you will know, that you have to learn, is opposition. Opposition means your king is directly opposite or is opposite of the opponent's king. That would be close opposition. And we will see later on that there are also distant oppositions and diagonal oppositions. So whenever you are not able to further move a piece or a pawn, you would lose, like c7, you would lose the pawn. Then you should bring your king into opposition of the opponent's king. King a6, getting the opposition, wins. King b6 would allow black to enter the opposition, to go into opposition, and then the game is a drawn. It's a stalemate. But with king a6 opposition, white goes again into opposition. White is able now to move the pawn and will promote. As already mentioned, there is not just close opposition, but there is also distant opposition. A distant opposition is very often just an interim step to enter, to be able to come into close opposition. Now in this case, in this position, black is to move, and black draws by going into distant opposition. Distant opposition means 2 further steps away from the king. That would be close opposition, and 2 further squares away would be distant opposition. 2 steps are important because each side has a move to do, and whatever white does now, black can go into direct opposition or close opposition and would draw the game. There is also diagonal opposition. Again, diagonal opposition is also very often a tool or an interim step to enter a close opposition. In this case, that would be a diagonal on one diagonal, the closest distance to your opponent's king. The diagonal opposition, and then it's again back and forth to close opposition, which forces black's king to finally lose contact to his own pawn and lose. And here we are in the zugzwang situation. I come to that term actually now. The next position. Very typical zugzwang or even reciprocal zugzwang position. Whichever side moves first loses. Whichever side waits, doesn't have to move, will win. Reason is, each side protects its own pawn and the opponent's, and attacks the opponent's pawn. So when you have to move your king, it will lose contact to your own pawn. If white has to move, then black will win the pawn and will win the game. If in this position it were black to move, black would lose contact to f5 and would lose the pawn and the game. So this is zugzwang or reciprocal situation. You would prefer as white not to move when it's your turn, but unfortunately in chess you always have to make a move. We show a similar position, which is, of course, zugzwang. You have to move, but you have to know the principles of zugzwang. You can put black into zugzwang, and you do not by moving your king to g5, because then unfortunately you are as white in zugzwang, and we have seen from the previous position that whoever moves first is losing. but you can put black into zugzwang by king g6. The king attacks the pawn, black has to defend the pawn, and now white goes into the zugzwang position. And indeed, this is a kind of maneuver which we see in the next example. This was a triangulation maneuver. White goes in a triangle and achieves zugzwang, where now it is black to move and black to lose. 3 more terms to learn. We have already heard about triangulation. This is a very typical position where white forces black into opposition or into zugzwang. So if black were to move, black could not go to c7 with the king, because after king c5, black would have to move away from the square b6. White would enter b6 and win the pawn on a6. Black can also not go to d8 because white can go into opposition with king d6 and then king c8, and the pawn advances to c7 and will promote. So unfortunately, it is white to move in this position. Knowing that black can never or cannot go to c7 when white is able to go to c5, black is forced to just move between b8, c8 and d8. So white can use a triangle way to win a tempo and to put indeed black into zugzwang or to enter opposition. And the triangle is from d5 to d4 or to c4, both is possible. Black cannot go to c7, so goes to d8. Then black goes to d4, white goes to b4, black goes back, and now white goes to d5. It's exactly the same position as the start position. However, now it is black to move. And we have seen black moving to c7 would lose the pawn a6 after king c5. Black moving to d8 would bring him into opposition by king d6, and the white pawn would promote. Another term to learn is shouldering. Shouldering means you prevent the opponent's king to reach certain key squares, certain squares which he needs to arrive to draw in this position, and you do that by blocking the path with your own king. So king g5, king d7, and now you don't advance your pawn because black would be able to reach g8 or h8, which would mean a draw, but you shoulder off black's king. Even now h4 would only draw, so you shoulder off the king. The king cannot pass this path, cannot reach g8 and h8, and now white's pawn will be promoted. I mentioned already key squares. Key square for the attacker in case of this pawn would be 2 rows ahead, the 3 squares in front of the pawn. So for a c3 pawn, it would be b5, c5, d5. If the white king can reach those squares, then he would win the game. Now, if black can prevent white from reaching those, then it would be drawn, and black could prevent it through, for example, through opposition. So if white would go d2, king e7, king d3, king d6, then it would be a draw only. White has to go around the pawn, go into diagonal opposition. So white goes into opposition now. And now it's direct close opposition. And now white has reached one of the key squares and forces black out, and the white pawn can promote. Last example, we have seen exactly this position previously, just the other way around. Now it is black, the board from the black point of view, and it is black to move. And the key positions for the defender of an H against an H pawn are the squares G8 and H8. If black is able to reach those squares, then he will draw the game. Now, white could prevent it. Of course, when white pushes the pawn, black would reach G8 and H8. White could prevent it by moving himself into H7. But then we have another example setup of a drawn rook pawn where indeed white's king is stalemated now. So after having learned 5 terms, there are 6 examples going through some of these terms, and actually these are exercises. So I open a position, and then you can stop this and try to solve the exercise. Exercise number 1 would be white to move and draw. Okay. The solution is go into opposition, even if that means sacrificing a pawn. That's the only way that you are able to go into opposition. Now it's diagonal opposition, and now it's direct opposition, and whatever black does, this is a clear draw. Example 2, white moves and draws. Now, after having seen the first example, this is easy. Same principle applies, going into opposition, and the only way to do that is by f4. Of course, white could go with king f2 into opposition, but black would be able to move a pawn, and then indeed white would lose the opposition. So the only way is, as in the previous example, sacrificing a pawn. Now diagonal opposition, black has to move the king, has to take the pawn, and now it's direct close opposition, and this is a drawn. Third example, and this is similar principle. You always have to think whether opposition, direct opposition at this moment helps. Now king g2 would be direct opposition, but then king f4, king f2, king e4 would take the pawn. You can go into direct opposition with king e2, but black has a spare move with his pawn to f5, and thus will be able to then enter direct opposition for himself. So always be aware of spare moves of your opponent. It's not always opposition. Opposition is when there is no other move possible. Having seen the first 2 examples, I think that is again easy. e5 brings you into direct opposition, and there is no way for black to win. Now we have seen 3 examples of opposition. Now black to move and draw. Well, having seen the examples of opposition, this is another example of opposition, this time though diagonal opposition. King f7, the only way to draw the game. Diagonal opposition, because after 1 move, black is able to go into direct close opposition, and that's a draw. Black to move and draw. So, same principle, opposition. And please avoid your opponent to have a spare move with a pawn. That means sacrificing your pawn on g5, not on g6, is the solution. Because then you are able to enter direct opposition here already, and if white takes the pawn, then it's again direct opposition, and it's a draw. We are coming to the end, and this is a more difficult endgame position, and to understand that, white is to move from the bottom here to the top of the board, so the pawn is on c2 and will promote on c8, and black is only 2 steps away from promoting the pawn on e1. White to win and draw. Okay, I show the moves, and they may come as a surprise. It's a very untypical endgame, and the only reason for being able to draw this position, white to move, is because the pawn against the queen is a bishop's pawn, and black in this position is unable to check the white king. So white is able to push the bishop's pawn to the 7th rank, and then the position is a known drawn, especially the king, the black king, is far away from the white king. This is an absolute drawish position. Of course, white has to be careful. White has to go into the corner if forced by check, and then black is unable to convert this material advantage into a win. So thank you very much for this endgame session.